I think the globalization and the transfer of intellectual ideas goes well beyond sort of the capitalist ideas of materials and goods, right? Knowledge has been kind of crossing boundaries for a very long time.
Knowledge has been crossing boundaries since very long time, and it has grown because we cross boundaries, because ideas cross boundaries. This is what makes things. So the most silly thing we can do, I think, is just focus on our own intellectual world, our own country, our own way of thinking, right? The more we look out, the more we get good ideas. So that's the background in which and I've always been very curious all my life. I mean, I'm a scientist, I'm a physicist, that's my specialty, but I've been reading about philosophy since ever. I've been reading about ideas from elsewhere since ever. But Nāgārjuna, it's a recent discovery for me, very recent. I mean, just a few years ago. So in fact, I've been writing a book on trying to make sense of the quantum evolution. I've been thinking about quantum mechanics for long. I've been starting writing in the 90s about how to think about quantum mechanics. And I had this idea, which it was hard to focus for me, that the core of quantum mechanics, the core idea, is not that there are observers, is that there are relations between things. So it's not that there is an atom and the scientist that observes. There's an atom and something else. And what the theory is about is how an atom manifests itself to something else, and how the something else manifests itself to something else. So the core, it seems to me that quantum mechanics is saying is that things exist because of their interaction with other things, in relation to other things, depending on other things. And then I had a number of people who, I was talking about that, said, have you read Nāgārjuna? And I didn't, precisely because of what you said. In the 80s, there was a lot of attempts to find similarities between Eastern and specifically Indian mysticism ideas and modern science. It's interesting, it's a good effort, good books being written, but I never found it very convincing, because I found they were sort of more superficial analogies than deep connections. So I resisted that. But then at some point I decided, okay, I'm going to read Nāgārjuna. And far from me to pretend that I understand it deeply, or that I understand everything one has to understand in Nāgārjuna, because it's a great thinker, it's a major thinker that has been studied from all different points of view. But the point for me when you read something is not to understand exactly what is there. It's what you can do with ideas that you take there. And so I read it. I read it in an English translation by an analytic philosopher, American, Garfield. And it was a fantastic discovery for me. I mean, it was one of the beautiful intellectual journeys, one of the most beautiful intellectual journeys of the last years for me, because Nāgārjuna has a way of telling us, look, you can't think at objects, at things, just as dependent on other things.
Right.
And once you realize that there is interdependency, you realize that the thing by itself is nothing at all. In his own words, is empty.
And it's a completely sort of brand new way of describing reality.
Exactly. Exactly. It's a completely brand new way of describing reality, of thinking about reality. And it's not, Nāgārjuna obviously didn't know anything about quantum mechanics. No, he could know anything. But he gives us instrument of things, way of thinking that are very helpful. Say, yeah, we can think that way. Yeah. That's the right way of thinking. It's the wrong way of thinking at the light of quantum mechanics is not, there is an object, a stone, there's another stone, and I have the properties of this, the property of this, the property of that. And then out of this, I'd say, well, they interact, they do things. No, that's the wrong way of thinking. The right way of thinking is that a stone is just the combination of the action that it does on anything else. And I can only understand it in terms of all what is around it.
Right.
And that's marvelous. And Nāgārjuna in this is, I think, reading his book was a marvelous trip for me, and it clarified my idea. And I think now I have a cleaner understanding of how one could think the world at the light of quantum mechanics.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think I'm also curious, right? In quantum mechanics, there are famously sort of two disparate sort of interpretations of quantum mechanics. So there's the many worlds interpretation. So there are these two sort of, they've been much debated. And I was curious if Nāgārjuna's view, the frame that you get from his way of thinking about reality, does that allow you somehow to reconcile these two views, or does it help you gather sort of evidence for one being a more apt description than the other?
I think it helps me to find one view more convincing, but I believe that it's not that one view of quantum mechanics is right, another one is wrong.
Right.
Feynman said at some point that a good physicist knows different ways of thinking about the same phenomenon.
Right. And that, one view is convenient in certain circumstances, and for other problems, another view. And I think this is the kind of thing that we do all the time. So, in astrophysics, it's really strange. I often say that I work on the exotica of the universe, like black holes and dark matter, but not as exotic as the kinds of concepts and things that you work on, right? So here's a recalibration. But, there are times in which having modeling a system, a very complex system that you can't go and actually touch and do kind of controlled experiments on, like astrophysical objects, sometimes it's really useful to think of them as simple, like, map it onto a known problem, which we often do in physics, which we all joke about as like the spherical cow problem. So, simplifying things, right? And simplifying in different ways, depending on the particular problem that you are your question that is of interest. So I guess you're saying that these interpretations of quantum mechanics are also quite similar to that they are...
Yes, they're similar to that, because you can simplify in different manners, but you can also, there's also something more. You can make up things in your mind. Let me give you an example. We talk about heat, right? And today we understand heat very well. Heat is something is hot. This pen is hot because the molecules are moving very fast. So there is no such a thing like heat. Heat is not a thing. Okay, this is completely clear. It's digested.
Yeah.
However, if I have a hot pen and a cold pen, I could think that there is something which is heat, which is here and then is moving there, and I sort of visualize in my mind like a fluid moving. Am I making a mistake? No, I'm not making a mistake, provided that I keep in mind that it's a useful picture that is good up to a certain point. And
right, it has limits. The explanatory power has limits, right?
Exactly. So there are a lot of notions which are good in a context, and we make a mistake only if we take them too seriously.
Right.
I can think that heat as a fluid, fine, perfectly fine. It's just if I take it too seriously, I make mistake, because after all, it's not a fluid, it's just molecules moving. And science is plenty of these things. So in a sense, if I take Nāgārjuna seriously, all notions are like that.
Right.
All notions are sort of provisional up to some point. And the most incredible chapter in the book of Nāgārjuna is that he talks about this emptiness.
Yes.
Meaning a thing doesn't exist by itself. It doesn't have an independent, autonomous existence. It only exists independent of everything else.
I mean, am I right in thinking that it also, I mean, he's also referring to the fact that there isn't like an ultimate essence to anything?
There
right?
is no ultimate essence to anything. That's exactly the point. There's no essence in everything, because essence is what characterizes the thing ultimately, independently of what is around the situation.
The qualia, right? There are no qualia.
Exactly. There are no final point. And then, so he calls this emptiness. So he says, this is empty, this is empty, this is empty, this is a characteristic. And then he discusses space, he discusses time, he discusses causality, he discusses all the basic ideas we can try to use for one by one, and shows that they're all empty. Okay?
Right.
And then one is tempted to say, okay, I got to the bottom of understanding reality. The basic bottom of understanding reality is emptiness.
Right.
And then there is this absolutely marvelous chapter in Book of Nāgārjuna. The title in the artificial title translation is "Emptiness is Empty."
Right.
In which he basically says, no, if you do that, you're making a mistake, because you're taking a concept that you're using for thinking about reality and taking it as autonomous, absolute, foundational for everything else. And that's a mistake. So the various ways we use to think about reality, they're not wrong, they're right, but we shouldn't take them too seriously, because they're always depending on something else.
I mean, I guess one way for someone who is, interested in these philosophical questions, as a person who reads and not working in analytic philosophy, is, would you say that, one view that might be useful to hold, and I use the word useful, very deliberately, because it has limits and it's pertinent in some situations and not universal, is that reality is really multifaceted. It's like a multi-dimensional polygon, if you will, and
yes.
that you want to view, some properties, some edges, some faces, then you have some useful tools that allow you to do that. And that, might you think that's a sort of a useful analogy? That kind
very
of
much so, because if you look at a lot of history of thinking, a lot of history of philosophy, in particular Western philosophy, but also in many strands of Eastern philosophy, the objective is to get to some absolute knowledge, some certainty, and some
truth.
The substance of everything, the final point on which you anchor everything. And if you think of the history of these attempts, if you look at them historically, what is surprising is that none of this ended up convincing everybody, right? Whether it's matter, whether it's spirit, where is God, whether it's my mind, the mind, whether it's structures, whether it's data of experience, whether it's reason, all the attempts to sort of found our knowledge and our understanding of the world on a single basic thing, they all turn out to be unconvincing. And one way of taking Nāgārjuna is saying, but that's the wrong question.
Yeah.
I mean, forget the question of the foundations. That's not what we want. We want to understand reality, because Nāgārjuna is not saying reality is all false and wrong and forget and you cannot understand it. No, not at all. He's saying reality is the chair, it's atoms. I mean, he wouldn't talk about it.
And it's comprehensible, right? It's
comprehensible. And we can understand more and more and more about it. And that's what we're doing. That's what you're doing when you study gravitational lenses and galaxies and so on. We're understanding reality.